This lesson is about the importance of treaties. So we're going to be looking at interactions between the early United States government and indigenous people. And here's our specific learning target. I can examine interactions between the United States government and Native Americans through the use of treaties in history. Take a look at this map. This is a map of Native American nations before Europeans colonized North America. So before the explorers came and claimed land for their European countries, this is what the United States looked like. See, all those different borders and colors, they represent different Native American nations. You see, sometimes when we think about Native Americans in our history, we kind of clump them all together as one thing, and it just wasn't that way. There were hundreds or maybe even thousands of different Native American tribes, and each one had its own unique government, and each one claimed different regions of the United States as their own. Of course, they didn't call it the United States back then. They called it whatever they called it. So they called it the Iroquois Nation, or the Crow Nation, or the Yakima Nation, or the Blackfoot Nation. They called it whatever they were called, right? And so we can see that different nations actually existed here before Europeans colonized it, and then eventually it became the United States of America. And so these are the people who were here first. And just like countries today, and just like countries all throughout history, sometimes these different nations of Native Americans got along with their neighbors and were peaceful. Other times they went to war against each other and were enemies, just like countries have done throughout history. So again, I want to emphasize that Native Americans were not one great big group of people, but instead they each had their own unique culture and their own unique histories and their own form of government, all throughout what is today the United States. And so that's why we have such a rich history and heritage on this land, because there are so many diverse groups of Native Americans before Europeans arrived. Then on this map, we can see how slowly but surely, actually it happened rather fast if you think about it in terms of all of history, as the United States expanded to the west, Native Americans lost their land. And so this GIF kind of shows us how Native Americans lost their land over time. I'll let you see it one more time. So there's the original 13 colonies in white. And then as we spread over to the west, we can see Native American land disappearing until today. They're given a few reservations throughout the country. Some key important words that we need to be looking at. I've been talking about the word treaty several times. A treaty is not to be confused with a treat, as in trick or treaty. However, we are going to see that many of these treaties maybe were tricks, but that'll play out in just a second. A treaty is actually a formal agreement between two different governments, and it has to be ratified, and that's another vocab word on the page there. But a treaty is basically a written agreement where two different governments agree on something, right? And it could be agreeing on whose land is where. It could be agreeing on what kinds of things we're going to trade back and forth with each other. Treaties come in all kinds of shapes and styles and forms, but they are an agreement between two countries or two governments. So then that word ratify down here, ratify means to make something official, to approve it, to like officially agree on something and make it happen. So a treaty, in order for it to be a real treaty, needs to be ratified. It needs to be made official. Then up top here, this word governance is very similar to government, right? And governance means to have authority or to make decisions over a larger group of people, right? And then the word sovereignty, we talked about that previously when we were looking at indigenous people and their sovereign lands that they have. Sovereignty is a type of political power exercised through a form of government over people, land, and resources. So when you have sovereignty, it means you get to be your own government, like you are your own nation. And that's what the Native American nations were and still are, the ones that are federally recognized today. So we're going to be looking at some treaties between Native Americans and the United States government. Take a look at this. Concluded during the nearly 100-year period between the Revolutionary War to the aftermath of the Civil War. So over the course of about 100 years, some 368 treaties would define the relationship between the United States and Native Americans for centuries to come. Today, we're going to be looking at 4 of them. So we're not going to look at all 368 treaties. We're going to look at 4. You're welcome. The treaties were based on the fundamental idea that each tribe was an independent nation, right? We've been talking about that. Native American nations were each their own sovereign country with their right to self-determination and self-rule. But as white settlers began moving on to Native American lands, this idea came into conflict with the relentless pace of westward expansion, resulting in many broken promises on the part of the US government. So let's take a look at how westward expansion ended up affecting those treaties that we made with Native Americans. The first one is the treaty with the Delawares, also called the Treaty of Fort Pitt in 1778. In September 1778, representatives of the newly formed Continental Congress signed a treaty with the Lenape, or Delaware, at Fort Pitt, Pennsylvania. In the first official peace treaty between the new United States and a Native American nation, both sides agreed to maintain friendship and support each other against the British. Doesn't that sound nice? They're going to be friends, and they're going to work together to fight the British. Yay, this is going to work out well, I can tell. But, there's a but. But mutual suspicion continued, especially after Pennsylvania militiamen killed nearly 100 Lenape, most of them women and children, at the village of Nananhooten in March of 1782, mistakenly believing they were responsible for attacks against white settlers. Hold the phone. So a bunch of white militiamen ended up killing 100 women and children because they believed those women and children were attacking white settlers. Yeah, okay. After the American victory, more and more white settlers moved on to Lenape territory until the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced them and other Ohio Country Native Americans to surrender most of their lands. So what started off as a peaceful friendship ended up by removing Native Americans off their land and forcing them to go somewhere else. That treaty was a trick. Then comes the Treaty of Canandaigua, Pickering Treaty, or Calico Treaty. So some of these treaties have more than one name, and it took place in 1794. Seeking to improve relations between his government and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a powerful group of 6 Iroquois-speaking tribes, the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations. President George Washington sent his Postmaster General, Timothy Pickering, to negotiate a treaty in Canandaigua, New York. So George Washington, who was president at the time, wanted to improve relationships with those 6 Native American nations. Okay. The treaty restored more than 1 million acres of land to the Seneca that had been ceded by treaty 10 years earlier, and recognized the sovereignty of the Six Nations to govern themselves and set laws. It also promised an annual payment by the United States to the Haudenosaunee of $4,500 in goods, including calico cloth. Yay! So George Washington sent his postmaster general to say, we're giving you 1 million acres of land. Here you go. Sorry things haven't worked out so well in the past. And also, we're going to give you $4,500 a year in goods and other things. Yay! The United States government is giving them back what was rightfully theirs. Oh boy, this is sounding good, you guys. Over the years, as the Six Nations territory was further reduced, the Onondaga, Seneca, Tuscarora, and some Oneida remained in New York on reservations, while the Mohawk and Cayuga left for Canada, and the Oneida settled in Wisconsin and Ontario. So in other words, even though we gave them 1 million acres of land, we then started taking it back by expanding into it. And so the Native Americans were overwhelmed, and they ended up finding other places to go or going to live on reservations. Then comes the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. I got a good feeling about this one, guys. This one's going to be good. It's going to work out well. I just feel it. As more white settlers moved west into the Great Lake region, a Native American confederacy, including the Shawnee and Delaware, who had already been driven westward by U.S. expansion, as well as the Miami, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, mounted an armed resistance beginning in the late 1700s. Okay, so you're telling me that the Native Americans are angry because they've been pushed off their land for so long that they're finally holding their ground against the U.S. Army. Kind of seems reasonable, but I don't like the way this is starting violently. After United States troops under General Mad Anthony Wayne, okay, anyone with the nickname Mad, things aren't going to be good, defeated them in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Miami Chief Little Turtle and other Native leaders ceded large parts of what would become Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin in the Greenville Treaty. So if they ceded it, it means they gave up their land, right? Because they lost to the U.S. Army. And not just a little bit of land. Think of the size of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. All those states' worth of land ended up going over to the United States, right? The Native Americans lost their land again. But the treaty provided only short-term resolution. As continued, the U.S. expansion quickly nullified its effect. In other words, they kept on expanding into that land. By 1808, Shawnee War Chief Tecumseh had organized a Native Confederacy to mount armed resistance to continued U.S. seizure of Native American lands. So you've got a leader of the Native Americans named Tecumseh who's going to say, hey, let's join up, let's join together, and let's see if we can fight off the United States Army. I wonder how that's going to work out. Let's find out at the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809. In this treaty, negotiated by President William Henry Harrison, then governor of Indiana Territory. So he wasn't president yet. At this moment, he was the governor of Indiana Territory. With Native tribes, including the Delaware, Potawatomi, Miami, and Eel River tribes, the United States acquired 2.5 million acres of land in what is now Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, the equivalent of about 2 cents per acre. So the United States bought that land from the Native Americans. However, Tecumseh, remember that name from the last slide, and others argued that the treaty's signers had no authority to sell the land and warned Americans not to settle there. So basically, it sounds like someone sold land that wasn't theirs to sell, right? However, in 1811, Harrison led an attack, basically saying, hey, someone sold us the land, so we're going to take it anyway. He led an attack on a Native American camp on the Tippecanoe River, beginning a new U.S. Native conflict that would last through the War of 1812. After Tecumseh's death in battle in 1813, his Confederacy dissolved. That means that those unified Native American nations kind of fell apart, along with his dream of Native American independence. So what they were fighting for, to get independence for Native American nations, is no longer in sight. So this is what happened between the United States government and Native American nations over time. And that was just 4 of those 368 treaties, right? So I'm curious if you noticed a pattern. How did each treaty begin? And then what ended up happening? Think about that for a moment. And so there we have examined those interactions between the United States government and Native Americans through the use of treaties in history. Something for us to think about as we consider moving forward as a nation and doing better in our interactions with each other.